Hi, Wangari.
Welcome, Wangari.
Hey, thank you guys, and sorry
Hey.
for that. I think well, the world's timing, so I think my time in my mind was 1 hour ahead.
Okay.
So thank you, Mama, for that, for saying, hey, Wangari, are you still joining us? Because I would have come after the end of the meeting. But I'm here. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you that you made it in 5 minutes. Wow. You have to take some deep breaths now before we start. So, I could start now. I think a lot of people are here, and I want to welcome every single one of you to be here in the live audience, and I also welcome all the people who will be listening to the interview when we publish it in October. And I welcome Wangari from Kenya. Thank you so much for being here, Wangari. I don't see you anymore, but maybe you hear me. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. I will not reveal too much about you before our interview, but I'm really delighted that you come here and do this interview with me. And I also welcome Victoria Behem. She's an advisor for culture and connection enhancing social design. And she will have a look over the chat and give the audience also a tiny little glimpse of her beautiful work to connect people so the audience can also have this little mini nutshell of little interactive stuff in between. Yeah, so I will give on to Victoria to give us some overview over this evening and the interview and the question, yeah, at the end.
Enjoy.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm really, really excited. This is the first interview I ever take. And I think we're both excited to do this. And I will give you a short overview about around the interview. So we will have a first set of questionnaires we prepared. I don't know if we can stick with it because sometimes interviews just flow. But the first few questions are about storytelling, like at the beginning, just storytelling from you, Wangari, and then we will move on to the storytelling in your homeland. And after that, we will move on to questions about what happens when stories travel around the world. So this is kind of the path we want to take throughout this video. And there was another little thing I have to say, because this interview is from the nonprofit organization Storybox Munich, and we are very happy if you, as the listeners, the audience and the listeners later, can donate a little bit in the project so it can move on and be long-term. So we will start. Wangari. Oh, I'm happy I'm through with the formal stuff in the beginning. So now we have the first questions about storytelling in general. But the first thing, what would be wonderful, if you would like to share where you are. I didn't say that. It was my script to say that. I didn't. So you can share it yourself, where you are and where you feel at home, and how you came to be a storyteller.
Okay, so hello everybody. How are you? First of all, apologies for being late, or rather for being an hour early from my side. I've just seen Momo's message saying, hey, Wangari, we're beginning soon. I hope you're going to make it. I'm like, what do you mean? I thought I still have 1 hour. But well, I think it is to be expected. I believe I told the Kenyans 10 o'clock our time, so hopefully they'll be here the next 1 hour. for the ones that who had registered. I am with you from Nairobi, Kenya, East Africa. I live in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya, and I think I have interacted with a few of you. Definitely with David. I think I have either seen or interacted with Norman as well, in a few things, but I'm really glad to be here with you guys today. And I think the idea of with Storybox about cultural awareness and storytelling and how stories travel around the world, I find it quite fascinating. I've been telling stories for a while now, for about, but about more than 10 years now. My background is theater. So before I did storytelling, I did a bit of theater and a bit of television and film here in Kenya. But I have to say that I never set out to become an artist. I think if you had asked me, okay, so do you think you would become an artist someday? It never occurred to me that I would be. And in a way, I say storytelling chose me, because I'm growing up, of course, I knew storytelling, I knew stories, but I never thought that, you know, that someone can actually, that we actually have people who tell stories for a living. And I think I'm one of the very few Kenyans actually who make a living purely through the arts. It's not something that is very common here because, of course, our structure is a bit different in terms of arts. So, you know, that's one thing that I have to say, I feel quite privileged. I know that it's not the norm here. Even so, most of the artists here do art on the side, but then they do something that brings in the money. So like I said, I've been telling stories for a while. I told my first story in the year 2006 at the Alliance Francaise here. But I have to say that even then, I never thought that I would be in the arts 10, 15 years later. And I think for me, the turning point for storytelling happened in the year 2010. We had a festival here, that a storytelling festival called the Sigana International Storytelling Festival. And by then, we would bring in storytellers from different parts of the world to come to Nairobi and share stories. And I remember 3 storytellers who, I have to say, like, you know, made a switch in my mind. That year, I was at a crossroads because I had done art for about 4 years or so. And things were not really working, and especially financially. And I remember meeting Dayan Talat from the US and Jiva Raghunath from India. They had come for the festival here. And they were just discussing, and they were asking, okay, so what are your plans for, you know, as an artist, for storytelling? And I said, honestly, I don't know. I don't know what plans I have for my life. And Jiva asked, oh, how old are you, Wangari? And then when I told them my age, they laughed and laughed and laughed. And they said, oh, we have been telling stories longer than you were born. And I think that's when it clicked to me, oh, okay, so this is actually really, it's a career. It's not just something you do to pass a face. It's something you can actually do. And, you know, it becomes your way of life. And the same year, I met the Canadian storyteller, Jamie Oliviero. And I loved how he worked. And I think for me, the one thing I remember is during the festival, the last show, what he did is that he asked the audience to just give him stuff. So an umbrella here, a pen, a book, a shoe, and he brought all these things on stage and he told a story purely with all those things. And I was like, whoa, okay, there seems to be really magic in storytelling. And I think from then, I think I kind of like figured like, okay, so you know what? I am good in this thing. I enjoy doing this thing. I can actually really plan my mind to do this. And I thank God that sometimes things happen and I'm thinking, okay, no, maybe it's not really sustainable financially, but something happens and I'm like, okay, you know what? All right, I'm gonna hold on a while before I apply for a job. And I remember, especially when I went to college and got my degree, my family was like, okay, so now you're going to get a proper job, right? And I remember telling them, no, I think I have found my footing. I think this is where I want to be. And whatever it is I've studied in school, I want to use that to help me in my art. So I usually say, I think storytelling found me. I didn't go looking for it, but it found me. And I'm glad because it's something I do gladly. You know, I can wake up at midnight to go and do a performance. I don't think it's many jobs that someone can actually say they enjoy doing. So I think that's a plus for me. So yeah, that's why I tell stories.
Wow, that's great. I tend to have fun giving interviews because it's one question and we just get so much energy and information. So I think most of the questions I have in my line are almost you almost answered them already. So I'm thinking about skipping a few, but I will just pop them up to you and maybe something comes up because these are the questions from our last community call. We always have community calls. I think Wangari, you were there, and some of you being here in the Zoom session too. And we gathered the questions from the community for the interview partners. So I will just shout them out and you just wave if you have something to say. There is a whole lot of questions like, what is storytelling to you? Is it something holy, foundation of your identity, culture, or is storytelling fun or healing? What is your individual point of view?
I think stories for me are home.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe that stories are, you know, the way human beings communicate. I always joke and tell people the only difference between me and a cow, or humans and a cow, or animals is stories. Because as human beings, we're structured to share stories of ourselves, of our lives. Because when you leave the house in the morning and you come back in the evening and someone asks, so how was your day? And you begin explaining how things happen, you're basically telling a story. So for me, stories are home, are a way to feel engaged to people, whether it's my people in my circle, whether it's my audiences. It's just a way of saying, hey, you know, we're human and let's celebrate that. Of course, being a Kenyan and being an African for that matter, storytelling plays a huge role because before Western education came here, stories were a way of teaching. You know, we were learning everything through stories, whether it's values, whether it's traits, whether it's, you know, like your family tree. We were learning this through stories. I didn't grow up listening to stories. I think my mother was a businesswoman and she was quite busy doing things, and I didn't find my grandmother. But one thing that my mother did is that she made sure I grew around stories by reading. Mm-hmm. She was always buying books, and not curriculum books, but storybooks. So in that way, I grew up around stories, and I remember learning my mother tongue through the books that she would buy, because she would buy the books and she would teach me how to read my mother tongue, because in school we learn mostly English and Swahili. And I would sit with her when she's knitting or she's weaving a basket or she's doing some embroidery, and I would read to her. So for me, when I think of stories, I think of home, because really it's the way that I bonded with my mother. I tell stories for fun a lot. I think stories are fun. It's a fun way to just teach without preaching, you know, because you can't pin me down and say, hey, Wangari, you called me greedy. No, I did not. I told you a story about the hyena, you know. But I also tell stories to engage with people, with audiences, and also to provoke discussions. Especially locally here, there's someone who was writing, and they say that Kenyans are very fluent in 3 languages. They are fluent in English, in Kiswahili, and in silence. We do not like discussing heavy things, huge topics that are likely to bring controversy. So we don't discuss those things, you know. We don't discuss things that we feel, okay, that was traumatic. Yes, it happened. Let's just have it. And I find stories are a good way to engage people in this. So that's also another reason why I tell stories, that I want to provoke people to be able to discuss things that they might not feel very comfortable discussing in other spaces, because I think stories give us that particular safe space to do this.
Is your audience discussing the stories while you're having the storytelling event, or is it more in a not event setting if you discuss the story?
So in some instances, we discuss the story afterwards, and I always tell people who book me for sessions, especially here, because they're always about, of course, traditional stories have morals. So what is the moral of the story? And I always tell them, I don't discuss morals, because I think everyone picks a story from a story, a lot of things, you know. So in such settings, I would ask people, okay, so what do you think you picked from the story?
Mm-hmm.
You know, as opposed to me telling them this story should teach you this and this and this. But also, for instance, sometimes I structure a question and answer as part of the session. So for instance, there's a project that I'm currently doing, which is quite uncomfortable to do, because it's stories about the colonial period. You're discussing Africa between the year 1880 and 1994. And like I said, especially here in Kenya, we don't discuss those things except in the curriculum, where it's very clinical. It's a very British concept, you know. This is what happened in colonial period. There are positive things and negative things, and that's it. So for that particular show that I'm doing in collaboration with the German musician, is that we actually structure the show to have a question and answer at the end, because we feel that people need to actually ask these questions that they might not be able to ask in other spaces, or they might feel uncomfortable to ask in other spaces. And especially because when you're discussing the topic of colonialism, it's seen as a very sensitive to African population. And for me, it is an opportunity to say, you know what, this is actually a space where we can have this discussion, so that you go home richer, I go home richer, and we can discuss these things, and you can ask whatever it is you want without feeling like you're going to be judged, without feeling guilty, you know. Because I remember when we were beginning the piece, and you were saying, okay, so you want to make the Europeans feel guilty. And I was saying, no, because as a person, I don't think guilt changes anything. If I'm always meeting you in a space where you're making me feel guilty, I'll just start avoiding you. Yeah. But sometimes we tell stories that are uncomfortable, because it is good to feel uncomfortable, because then you think about something in more than just looking at the face value, and then you can discuss such things. So yes, I think stories have a way of leading you to places that you never thought you would be.
That's true. I saw your program in Munich, the program Colonism, musical oral history performance, and it really touched me a lot, and it gave me a lot of insights. And yes, it was uncomfortable, but it was really, I think, all of these. Well, we have to look at uncomfortable things. If you don't look at the uncomfortable things, nothing is going to change. And I think it's just the capacity of letting this history touch you and your heart, and seeing things from very different perspectives really is a very big and healing work you're doing. This is where we met, and that's why I called you also to come here to the interview. So yeah, I don't know if you want to sum it up, because I have a question about that, especially that performance. And I think you said a lot of it, but maybe if I read the question, you can sum it up a little bit more to make it I don't know, maybe. So I'm just going to do it. Can you share in a nutshell what the performance is about, the core messages, and about your experiences when touring with this program in Europe as well as in Kenya? That was the question.
The program is basically about perspectives. Every story has different perspectives depending on who is telling it. And I feel, and also my colleague in the session, we feel that, for instance, the story of the colonial period has always been told from the lenses of either Europe or the West. And that would explain why, for instance, in Kenya, we are still teaching about the positive effects of colonialism in the school curriculum. So the reason we were telling that we're doing that show, we said, you know what, let's have an African perspective to this. Let's have a discussion and saying, okay, so this is what happened, and also looking at also the lenses that the stories are told. So for instance, when we talk about the stories of the colonial period and the fight for independence in many African countries, you're going to hear about the political figures. So in Kenya, we hear about Jomo Kenyatta. If you go to South Africa, it's about Nelson Mandela. If you go to, the political figures that are always mentioned. And most of it is actually men. And so I've been asking, okay, so what about the other people who are living during this period? And how are they affected away from the politics of it? What about the women? What the women? So for instance, here when you talk about the fight for independence, you talk about the Mau Mau who went to the forest. It's mostly the men who are mentioned, and the women are saying, okay, the women took food and they took guns, but we don't really talk about how they were involved in the day-to-days of it. And we decided to look at it from very diverse backgrounds. So for instance, we're looking at it away from the politics. So in Kenya, we look at a family that lived through this period. And we look at a woman who was actually alive until 2 months ago. And she was the wife of one of the biggest freedom fighters that we know in this country, and just how her life was just messed up and how she actively participated in the fight for independence. If you go to South Africa, we're looking at, so in Kenya, it's almost like a love story that grew during that particular period. If you go to South Africa, we're looking at how can you make change wherever you are with what you are. And so we look at the story of Miriam Makeba, who all of us know as an absolutely amazing musician, but very few of us know that she actually lost her citizenship because she was singing against the apartheid regime. And for many years, she was away from she couldn't go back to South Africa, and only went back in the 90s after South Africa had gained independence. And in Namibia, of course, we're always having these discussions. I think right now it's very, it's happening, especially in Germany, about the Hereros. And it's always about, okay, so the massacre happened. And for that particular one, we actually look at it through the lenses of a girl who lived, an 11-year-old girl who lived through this particular period. So for her, the politics of, okay, the Hereros, the Nama, the colonial period, it didn't even register in her mind. And for me, it's also a very interesting and very strange show to do, because I'm used to working with traditional stories, which are very safe for me. I can change them when I feel like I can do this. But when we're dealing with a factual story, you really want to tell people, it's a story I'm telling you, but it's actually happened. So it's always about trying to find a link to what happened then and now. And for instance, the story of Namibia, we were very lucky to find a book written by the grandchild of this girl, who I think now lives in Norway, telling this story. And we wrote to them and asked, okay, can we use your story as a backbone for this? Mm. So it's been interesting doing the piece, and especially having the discussion afterwards and saying, okay, so tell us, what do you think about this? And making it that this is, we always get asked, okay, so is this if this is an African perspective, why are you doing this show with a white person on stage? And we were in Kiel, and when the question was asked, someone from the audience said, can I answer that question? And they said, this is not an African discussion. It's not a European discussion or a Western discussion. It is a human discussion. That is why it is important for everyone to be here to have this discussion about it. So it's been, it's been an interesting challenge doing this particular show.
Are the discussions different if you are in Europe or in Kenya, or are there different questions at the end, or is it more or less? I would expect different reactions, but is it like that?
Yes and no. For instance, one thing that I found very strange and also very sad on my part, especially when we do this show and we've done it to secondary schools here, is that it is really, really much harder to convince Kenyan students that there was nothing positive about this period. Harder than it is, for instance, when we do the show in Germany or we did it in Zurich, because when you're doing it, like, no, that's not true. I mean, like, because we're looking at things like, okay, so we learn in school that, for instance, colonialism brought an end to slavery. And colonialism brought, infrastructure, roads and railways for the benefit of the African population. That's what we're learning in school.
Wow.
And when you do this show, for instance, in Germany or in Zurich, people are very quickly saying, well, I don't really think so, because yes, we know they did the railways, but it was mostly for the raw materials to be transferred to Europe and to the West. But because for 60 years and counting, the Kenyans here have been learning that this is a positive thing, it is very hard to convince students, especially, that there was nothing positive, because they say, but this is what we've been learning in school. This is what I am expected to write in my exam when it comes. So actually, when you're doing the last piece, I have to tell the students, you know what, for the next 10 minutes, please forget what you've learned in school, in class. Even with the teachers here, forget about it. And then when you go out of that door, pick it up, because you will need it for your exams. And now just have a discussion. And now, especially in Kenya, we have a very open discussion saying, okay, of course, the roads and railways and schools were built, but where does the railway start? And where does it end? And they tell you, yeah, it begins at on the border to Uganda at the lake, and it goes all the way to the coast. And you ask, so why don't we have the railway in these other parts? Why don't we have schools there? Why don't we have the hospitals there? And they begin to say, oh, that is interesting. Okay. Oh, wow. No, they begin now seeing it, but it takes time for them to actually see that. And we tell them, please, we're telling you these stories for you to use in your life away from school. But unfortunately, for as long as you're in school and you're supposed to sit a history exam, please write what you have been learning in school, because that is what is expected from you.
Wow, thank you. This is we had that I don't know, it was a discussion, I think, after the we were talking about that after the show, and that was for me really like, oh, because I have kind of expected it the other way around, like. So thank you for sharing. That's really great. Well, I think we have to go on in our questionnaire to come back to the more traditional stories or storytelling. And I'm having the last question about your storytelling, and you said it in a little side note that you can't change the story in your program about historical persons, but you can change stories, and that is exactly what a community member of the calls asks for traditional stories. How do you choose the stories to tell? Do they come to you? And do you change your idea while telling? That's the question of the community call.
I mostly tell stories that I read or I hear, and I'm like, wow, I like this story. So a lot of times I tell stories that I like, and sometimes I've had comments like, okay, but you really enjoyed that story, because I like telling them. So a lot of the stories that I tell, something has spoken to me in the story, and they're like, wow, this sounds really nice, and I want to tell it. So I tell stories that I've had, either growing up, I've read from books, or I've encountered in different places. And of course, the stories have different versions. Kenya is a very multicultural country in itself. So you find that even one story has different versions among the different communities. So I pick, versions that I feel, this I like, And I know it's a big debate about, should you change stories or should you tell them the way you receive them? And I always say, change them, because I don't think that my great-grandparents told my grandparents the same stories, the same way that the grandparents told their kids. And I think it's evolution of humankind, that the thing that stories you tell change depending on the context, depending on who you're telling, and also what message you want to put. So for instance, if I want to tell a story and I love a particular version, but I feel like, in this particular bit, this version is more interesting, I will definitely pick it, as long as I feel that it doesn't really affect the story, that's how the story is told. And sometimes I will even manufacture some pieces. I'm like, yeah, I think I want to add this piece here, as long as I feel that it doesn't really change the story as it is. But sometimes, if I change a story and I feel that it significantly changes the story as it is, I will tell the audience that in the original story, this is what happens. But in my story, then I tell it. And this is especially because there are also a lot of things that in traditional context, especially in the African context, in the Kenyan context, were considered right in those days, which are not, nowadays when you speak about it, it's a bit, So things like, like characters being polygamous, was, so a lot of stories have these kind of motifs. Things like, like FGM and female circumcision, in some stories you feel like, this was a big piece there and you can really remove it. And for me, in those kinds of stories, I of course I would say that in those days this used to happen, and it was allowed, it was agreed. And I find that I don't also want to change it that much, because I want to have a discussion afterwards that, well, in our story this happens, but what do you think about it today? And then you can have those kinds of discussions. But I always say, what, if you feel that, for one reason or the other, you want to change a story, I'm a big advocate for changing, because it depends also who you are telling. And for instance, also when telling non-African stories to, for instance, Kenyan audiences, you find some characters who are not found in Kenya, for instance. So of course I might find myself changing the character to be a character that the children, especially here, can actually relate. But also luckily that doesn't happen very often, because with the advent of television, of course, even though you don't have any bears or tigers, the children already know these kinds of animals. But I find ways, and sometimes actually the story might change even when you're telling it on stage. One story that I love to tell is about it's about a girl who gets born and gets a lot of suitors, and a lot of things happen. So they go away, the men go, they land, they come and rescue the girl. And then at the end of the day, ask the audience, so who should get the girl from these three men who clearly have all played a very big part to saving her life? So because the story says that, so she's a very beautiful girl and every man wants to have her, but then the father says, I have no problem with this, but you need to tell me something. What are the main life skills that the human being needs to have? And of course the men don't know. So they say, okay, all right, okay, we're going to go out and find out, and then we're going to come back. So they go and they excel in different ways. And when as their graduation gifts, they get three things. So one gets a feather. And this feather allows him to fly whenever he wants. And then one gets a mirror that when you look in the mirror, you can see whatever it is you would want to see. And another gets a leaf that heals everything. So on their graduation, so they meet together and they say, hey, we should head back to there, and then, we can see who gets the girl. And then the young man with the mirror looks and says, oh, wow, no, actually the girl is really sick. and she looks like she can die anytime. So what do we do? And the other young man says, well, I have my feather. Can we jump on it and then we can, can fly? And so that's what they do. All the three of them hold the feather and they fly to the girl. And then the one with the leaf uses it to heal the girl. So of course, even for the audience, everyone has very high stakes. They're like, yeah, if the one with the mirror didn't see that she was sick, then they would have taken much longer and she would have died. No, but even if he had seen, if they didn't have the feather to fly with, then, they would have taken much longer. And even if they came and they didn't get the healing. So of course you ask the audience, so who do you think should actually get the girl, so to say? And sometimes you get an audience that is very convincing, lying on one side. And you actually say, well, I think I agree with you. I think we'll give this young man that you have chosen to have this. But then the ending that I have in my bag usually is that, it becomes clear that all of them really played a part in this, and all of them seem to have an equal claim. So what happens is that the girl turns into a pot. And the three young men turn into stones. And that's why if you come to an African fireplace, you'll find that the fireplace has 3 cooking stones and a pot. And that's always, whenever you see this, you remember that story about how this came to be.
Oh,
but sometimes, of course, if the audience really convinces me that one young man should win, then we say, okay, yeah, we agree. That man won the girl and they had a big party and, that kind of thing.
I was thinking about the girl belonging to herself at the end. Yeah. Beautiful. So I have to jump out of this story to get on with the interview. I kind of was listening. Well, we're in the middle of a storytelling in your homeland now, and you already talked a bit about that. And come and see the question I have here. One attendee of the community calls had the question if storytelling is still alive in your homeland, if it's still being lived. Well, can you tell us a bit about storytelling in Kenya? How the landscape of storytelling is there?
So storytelling still happens a lot, especially, well, not as much as it used to be, because as you know, it was mainly a preserve of the grandparents to tell the stories to the grandchildren around the fireplace. But now the grandparents are becoming younger and younger. So by the time you're 50, you're a grandparent, you still haven't even retired yet. So you have a full-time job and you're busy doing your things. And also with urbanization, families are no longer living together. So, it becomes very hard to have this tradition, but it is still happening, especially in the rural areas. And also, looking back over the last 10 or so years that I've been telling stories, when I joined storytelling, I think I could actually count the number of professional storytellers in Kenya on one hand, tell you this and this and this and this. And it was mainly the team that I learned storytelling with, because I learned on the job. But I think over the last 10, 15 years, it has spread away from Nairobi, because it was mostly around Nairobi, to other cities around the country, and also spread from the traditional grounds, because most of the time we would tell stories in schools. And now you're getting, telling stories in different places, for conferences, and also for like very diverse things, for things like peace and reconciliation, for things around land. So that's also one thing that has really changed, that there are a bit more storytellers now, and they are spread also around the country. And then something else that has also changed is also the way stories are told. Mm-hmm. One thing that has remained is that African or Kenyan storytelling is a collective affair. When an audience comes to a storytelling show, they are expecting to participate, which I think is something I found very different from, in other places. Like, when they come, they know that they expect you to engage them, and they're ready to do this. So there's going to be song and the music and dance, even if it's just a solo teller, and the audience is just very quick to pick in and join in. That is one thing that has remained, and I love that. Something else that has changed over the last few years. So for instance, yesterday, I think I told you I was doing something at a book festival that was running this weekend. And as I'm walking, I see a group of young people gathering after the National Theatre, and I'm like, okay, so what's happening? And I find this young man who is telling stories, and he is not using English or Swahili, but he's telling stories in Kenyan slang, which is something very uncommon, because of course most of the telling here happens in English or Kiswahili, because it's a very cosmopolitan city, for instance, in Nairobi. And I'm sitting here, and he asked a question, and it's like, hey, Wangari, do you know? And I'm like, okay, wow, I didn't even know you know me. And then afterwards, he comes and he says, of course, I know you, because before I began doing storytelling, you are the people that I followed, and I saw what you're doing. I've watched your videos, you know, on YouTube. And I love the concept that he is using. He's a very young man, I think probably in his early 20s, which was also very unusual here. And he's doing something that I've seen happening a bit in Europe. It's a new concept here, where he, once a month, he gathers a number of people and they walk around the city, and he tells stories about the different places, some of the buildings, some of the streets. And so when I met him at the theater, that he was telling the story about the theater, and also one of the reasons why, for instance, you know, that most of the revolutions in colonial Africa happened after World War II. And so he's explaining this story about how many Kenyans were recruited to go and fight for Britain, and when they come back, they know how to use guns, they know strategies to use in fight, but then they come back, they come back to the coast by ship, they come by train to Nairobi, and they're dumped there. So what did you expect? And he's telling all these stories in slang, and I found that really interesting. So I'm happy that I'm also seeing growth, not just in the number of storytellers who are telling stories, but also in the different ways that stories are actually being told, away from the traditional setting of, okay, you guys, please sit down, let's have a story. This is actually walking and telling stories of the different places, and I really, really love that.
Hey, thank you. Okay. Yeah, there was a lot of. I'm skipping a bit. It's also about how do you, well, maybe this one. How do you engage your audience in your cultural heritage was another question, but you just like but maybe the question about how do you do it is interesting for the storytellers and interested audience. Do you have something about that?
Yeah, so I think mostly in terms of engaging, it will be maybe a song that the audience can sing together, or a chant. Sometimes it can be a very easy dance step or a question and answer. So depending on the story and depending on the audience, you know, sometimes just choose spontaneously. Okay, so I think this will work in this particular way. Yeah, so depending on the audience. But you know, I love using songs and chants and tongue twisters to just get the audience engaging.
Yeah, if I see the performances like that, I feel like it's you have like a magic box and you just take some interactive stuff out of it. And I think, okay, I want to have a magic box too, because I love interaction too, very much, like getting engaged. Beautiful. Well, we're at the end of the middle section with the question: is there anything else about the setting for storytelling events in your homeland that you want to share? Do you feel something missing, or did we get everything about?
Yeah, I think we kind of told it. So yeah, and mostly I think we're very big on oral. So yeah.
Yeah,
for every different story you'll get like 10 different variations of the story in oral format. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we're getting to the third section. That's good because if we're in time, I'm happy. This is good, working out very good. So if stories, that's the core question, I think, if stories travel around the world is what happens with them. So when you had this talk about changing stories, and if you how you feel like changing stories, I think this is how I feel also myself. But how do we cope with that if we have stories coming from around the world, traveling from like through books and storytellers in everywhere? So this is kind of questions about stuff like that. And the first one would be is there anything that is important to you if stories of your heritage travel to international storytellers? Are there stories that you think should only be told in a setting that is appropriate for the stories for them?
Personally, I love it. I love it when I go to an event or I am checking online and I see someone actually telling a story from Africa, from Kenya. Because I think for me it's like, oh wow, you know, that's a really like huge acknowledgement of like, aha, you know. So I always enjoy when I see this. What I would hope to see more is, you know, a lot of times when you hear such stories, like, okay, this is a story from Africa. And I'm just like, wow, Africa has 54 different countries. It has 5 different regions, the East, the West, the North, the South, and the Central. I wish people would take a bit more time to find out exactly where, because, you know, the joy of being, oh, wow, I'm represented, but I'm like, okay, but it's still, it's watered down when someone just says a story from Africa, because, I mean, even me as an African, you know, I don't know stories from many of the different countries. So it would be actually be nice to hear someone saying this story is actually from this country, or this is from this part of Africa. So I love when they're doing that. On the other hand, there are also things that sometimes someone says, okay, I'm going to tell you this story from Africa. And then when they tell it, I'm like, yeah, that story, it may be from Africa, but there's a lot of things that are not African. And so, for instance, I think a few days ago, okay, Kenyans, I think we love just dealing with everything with humor. And our vice president was in Colombia for an official trip, and in his speech, he says about, oh, Kenya has very many different animals. There are lions and elephants and tigers. And, you know, like on Twitter, everybody was just saying, wow, you know, we need to go and find those tigers. Where do we find those? Because we don't have tigers in Kenya. And it's more or less the same thing that sometimes you find in stories. When a storyteller from other places tells a story from Africa, and maybe there's something like a tiger there or a bear, and I'm like, that cannot be, you know, like you need to be more specific, because we don't find those kind of characters in African stories. So, and I understand also because, for instance, many of the of the African folktales that I find in books are actually found mostly in Europe, in the West. And they are written by Europeans, especially the missionaries, or people who were in that period of African history. So I would think that they were also like Wangari, who said, okay, well, I love this story, but let me change it in a bit that my audience understands. So that's how you find a tiger and you find a bear in a story that is otherwise told it's an African story. So for me, I really wish that as storytellers would try to go beyond that and saying, okay, instead of saying this is an African story, but how about a little bit more? Where does it come from? And does it ring true? But otherwise, I have absolutely no problem, you know, seeing African stories on the stage. I love that, because I feel seen, I feel represented, I feel like, okay, wow, this is actually something really nice happening.
Yeah, I think that doing research and finding out all of these things, finding versions, and that's really a big topic, because sometimes as an artist, you feel like you have to get so deep into that if it's a story from Huawei. So this is also why we're doing this project to kind of get into contact. And if so, it would be nice to have to ask questions like stuff like this. Are there motives or characters you want to share your knowledge about so that the stories can travel with a deeper understanding?
So, for instance, also because most of African history was and stories were actually not in written formats, as opposed to the rest of the world. Of course, sometimes you find someone came and picked a story, and you don't really know where it is from. But I find some things that might give you an idea of where the story comes from. Maybe not from the country, but from the region. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, I love trickster stories.
Yeah, me too.
And yeah. So, of course, if you find a story that has the spider as a trickster, that definitely comes from the west of Africa. And it could be a pointer. It could be, from Nigeria, from Ghana. It definitely comes from the west. And also, if you find the hare is mostly found in Bantu-speaking communities around the continent. So you a lot of times when you find, I find a story about the hare as a trickster as a trickster, then I know it's highly likely to be either an East African story or also from the south of Africa. So you may find stories from South Africa, for instance, from Lesotho, from Botswana, and from East Africa also have the hare as, for instance, the trickster. And also, I also find that if you go to also the south, also you find the jackal as a trickster, which you don't really find if you come to the East Africa. Mm-hmm. So it's small things like this that may also give you pointers as to where the story comes from. So looking at the characters, this, like, if you see Anansi, it's definitely from the west. Like you may not know exactly where, but definitely going to come from the west. So it's small stories like this. Also stories about trickster gods. Mm-hmm. I find this comes a lot especially from areas like Nigeria. And there's this one story that I've seen also by many storytellers, the story of the trickster god Eshu, the mm-hmm. one who is wearing either a hat with 2 different colors or a robe with 2 different colors. And he walks, and once his side sees this color, that color, then that for instance is very, very, very definitely from West Africa, from Nigeria to be specific. Mm-hmm. So it's small things like those that if you look at the story more keenly, then you might have an idea, okay, so it's an African story, but where in Africa can it lie? And sometimes we don't know these things. Like we don't know, I can tell this is a Kenyan story, or this is a story from Algeria, for instance. So I always say, if you're going to tell the story, just say, this is a story from Africa, most probably comes from the east or from the west, from the central. I'm not sure which country, but it's more specific as opposed to saying, I'm going to share with you an African story mm-hmm. that, makes me feel some type of way.
Yeah, we were talking about that when we met in Munich, and I was thinking about this south, north, west, east, and central to say something like that. I don't know if that would be appropriate for Europe to do that as well, that you don't locate it in one country, but more in like the directions of the continent, because so that's just my idea. I don't know if that connects to anybody. So well, the next question would be, how have stories of your home and origin been dealt with in the past, and is there anything you would like to address?
So I think in addition to the whole idea of African stories, one of the ways that I love when stories travel. So for instance, some time back I was doing an online collaboration piece about stories from the lake, and I was paired with the Welsh storyteller Kat Little, mm-hmm. I think. And when we were choosing what stories to tell, I said, you know what? I think there's a story that I know is a very Kenyan story that I would love to tell. And it comes from the west side of Kenya. It's actually grounded on a lake that is there. That even today you can actually go and find. It's an archaeological site in Lake Victoria where you see footprints of humans and animals going into the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a story that actually comes from this place. And when I said, I think that would be an interesting story to tell, and then she said, you know, there's also another story here in Wales that is 90% the same story. And she said, the only difference is that your man marries an older woman, our man here marries a younger woman. And while you are saying that there's actually a physical space, there's a physical so-called evidence to your story, in Wales, there is no natural phenomenon around it. And we've got this whole discussion. They call it Lady of the Lake, and here we know it as Nyamgondo, the story of Nyamgondo. And we had this whole discussion about, because I mean, those two stories, if you listen to them, you'll be like, okay, so who parted from who?
Yeah.
And you were having this kind of saying, you never know. I mean, because long even before the colonial period, for instance, Africa was engaging with people from different continents. There was trade. This story comes from around the lake. So who knows, maybe there was something around the lake. It could also have come through the colonial period that someone went and learned that story from the West, and they were like, okay, you know why? I love this story. I would want to, it's part of England. Let's have this story around it. So sometimes you find stories that make you think, that is interesting. And also, for instance, in terms of stories traveling, I find also a very big resemblance, for instance, to the stories of Nasruddin, from which is around Turkey and things like that, and the stories of Abu Nuwasi, which is from the Kenyan coast and Zanzibar and Mauritius. So in a way, stories have always been traveling throughout the time. I think the only difference, especially in terms of the stories of Nasruddin and the stories of Abu Nuwasi, is the local context about where the story happens and the names. So stories, I love when I find things like that, and I'm like, that is a story from your hometown. We have something around that is from my hometown. So I think in a way that stories have always been traveling, and they will always be traveling. So sometimes when I find someone and says, no, this is a story from this place, and I'm like, no, this is a story from this place. It is possible that all of us are right and wrong at the same time, because,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I did. Oh, we have skipped one question. That would be nice. That's a question from a community call. And she asks, how can I, as a storyteller from Europe, promote awareness and mindfulness in a way that is connecting through compassion? What is the path? What are the words to this? I think it's about the feeling to kind of yeah, I think maybe we have already got the answer in your context. Or do you have something to that question?
Not really, but I think it's always just try and find out. Don't make, of course, we are storytellers, we are creative people, we make up things sometimes. But before you make up something in a story that is not from your culture, try and find out that there is actually no real answer for the question you're asking. And for instance, this goes so even locally in terms of culture. So for instance, for a long time, you find that people from different communities. So my community has always said, oh, you're those people from the other side who always remove six teeth below. And it's always looked at, when I was growing up, it was like a very, very demeaning way of thinking, like, oh, those people who do those kinds of things. Until a few years ago, I go to the west of Kenya and I meet someone and they were saying, yeah, because, what happened is that many years ago, there used to be a kind of sickness around this area whereby people would convulse, and then it would be very hard to open your mouth to get medicine into you. So if you do not have the lower teeth, then it is easier to push medicine into your mouth when it happens. And I thought, I mean, that's a very, very logical reason why this is like that. So before we make up something about a story, find out if there are any, like sober logical reasons why the story is the way it is. And even if sometimes you need to explain part of a story, please do. Please do that. And I can see also Mshai is in the house. Mshai is one of the storytellers that I look up to in Kenya, who has basically seen me growing from a clueless artist who didn't even know what they wanted to do to a storyteller. And I'll mention something that she does. She tells stories with, we call them kangas. And a kanga is really, it's a piece of cloth that is really like very colorful, that almost all women in all homes, not just in Kenya, but in the East African region, you will find in the house. And they usually have sayings on them. And she has been doing this line of stories about where do these sayings come from. And which I find very interesting. So it's the same thing that before you make up something in a story from a culture that you don't know, please make sure that you have like really tried to find out why that was the way it is. Yeah.
So the last little bit of the questions about research. That's where we're landing in the interview. Because sometimes like, yeah, I want to find it, and how can I do it? And so the question is, if you know research sites, books, or other ways in which we as storytellers can understand the stories more deeply. And if you have valuable hints or links or websites, and that's also for the audience listening to this, we have on the Storybox World website, there's one site with links and talks, and we want to fill it up from the international community. So this is the question for you in the interview, and also it opens up to the community, because this interview is also coming to an end in the next minutes. That we will want to really make it a community project where we can gather all these things. Do you know something like research sites or books you could share with the storytelling community?
That's what I was actually looking at before you told me my time is up. Like I have to be there. So I hope I can be able to share a few, maybe after this.
Yeah.
But also I realized that, for instance, a lot of African tales have actually been researched by different universities in the West. And unfortunately, they're not open to the public. So if you have any links to universities that actually do this, I remember actually, I think one of I was researching about stories from Kenya, and I saw a link. And there's actually the university in the US that actually has stories from that specific, like 10 different stories from the specific community. And I was like, but I couldn't access them. So I think universities especially have been able to do this. And I also remember years ago going to a festival in Sweden, and someone from the audience comes and tells me, oh, I heard you said you're from Kenya. About 30 years ago, when I was a student at my university, we came to Machakos, which is about an hour or two away from Nairobi, to do research on stories, and we have them in our university. And I was like, that's amazing. Can I access? And it was like, unfortunately, you can't, because it's the property of the university. But I think especially universities do a lot of research, and I wish there was more collaboration between the researchers and the performers and the artists, because then we can be able to use this material without having to do double work that has already been done. One person that I when I was looking at working with nonfiction stories and stories especially from Kenya, and I was looking at the story of Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, and I was checking online, and I realized there was actually, for instance, a storyteller from, I think she's from Norway. Her name is Georgina Cable, and she had actually, so I actually saw the story she had done about Wangari Maathai, and I loved what she had done with it. And what actually struck me, because I mean, you could see that she had put a lot of research and work with it, because even though she used Wangari's book as a research, how she begins the story. And she begins the story by very simply explaining just how big the continent is.
Mm-hmm.
It just says, you can actually, fit India and this, and then explains the Berlin conference very simply by saying, the countries came down and not the way you cut a cake. That's what they did. They said, okay, you have this piece, have this piece, have this piece. And then now she tells the story, and you could actually see that she had done a lot of research, and it's called, it's in a series called Dangerous Women Project, and you can find it online. And I think that's also, like, for me, I felt very warm seeing that, because you could actually see that she has done stories from different women around the world, but she has actually put in the effort to give context before she shares the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that after this, I can also share some of the links. And also, if you have friends in any of the universities, especially doing anthropology and literature, they have a lot of this research, and maybe we should have a discussion with them about how to make this more accessible to
that's a good idea.
practitioners.
We'll take that in the project.
Yeah.
So I have one last question. What is this is a community question from a community call attendee. What's your favorite story? Why is it your favorite story? And why are you called to share it with other people?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. What's my favorite story? I have a lot of favorite stories, but maybe I can share with you the story that I love.
Oh, great. We would love to hear one.
And yeah, it's one of my favorite stories, and it's also one of those stories that has had different versions. And I've had people saying, no, the version I know doesn't say that. I said, my version that I love says this. And it's a story that comes from my community. And we Kenyans, our signature is we love eating meat. And if you ever come to Kenya, I've had friends from Europe who say, it's very hard to be a vegetarian in this country. And especially when you go to the up country, one of the ways we welcome you is by slaughtering something for you, whether it's a chicken or a goat. Like, it's a way of telling you, welcome and feel at home. So in a country that is really big about meat, and especially roast meat, not your kind of roast meat that is barbecued, in an oven that is using electricity. No, we don't do that. With charcoal. So that when you're actually eating the meat, you can actually, smell and taste the charcoal in the meat. And we call it nyama choma. So we call meat in Kiswahili nyama. And we have a game that we loved playing when we were children. And it's basically, when I say nyama, 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 which is meat, 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 I would like all of you guys to answer and say nyama. Let me try and type that, because, okay, I can type. So you say, basically, just say nyama. Can you show that? Please, if you're on mute, put your microphone on and just say nyama.
Nyama.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So when I say nyama, 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 you say?
Nyama.
Nyama.
No, just say nyama. You say what?
Nyama.
Let's try it out. Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama.
Nyama, nyama. Well, in a country that loves eating meat, so they say that among the Kikuyu people, many years ago, Kikuyu women were not allowed to eat meat in public. And in fact, even though they took care of the animals and they knew where to put the animals out to pasture, to give them water, to keep them clean, they could never pick an animal to slaughter, whether a chicken or a goat. No. They had to wait for the men in their lives to decide what was going to be slaughtered, when it was going to be slaughtered, and for the man to cook the meat and give the women whatever pieces he wanted to give them. And even when they were given the meat, the meat out in public. They had to eat it inside the house, hidden to make sure that no one sees them eating meat. Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama.
Well, so they say that it would have gone on like this for years and centuries, maybe even until now, were it not for one young girl whose name was Washo. Now, Washo, they say, was the only daughter, the only child of her mother and father. And maybe the father felt that this was the son that he didn't have. So when it came to slaughtering meat or roasting meat, well, Washo would sit and slaughter meat with the father, roast the meat, and together with the mother, they would sit and they would have their meat. And Washo, Washo loved eating meat. But she was a beautiful girl, and she was also very, very hardworking. So she was known all over. And when it came time, well, she was no longer a young girl, but a young woman. They were gathered by the many old women, and they were given instructions. They were told, hey, you know what? You are no longer young girls now. You are young women. You are ready for marriage. And they were given the wisdom that had been gathered by their mothers, the grandparents, about how to take care of a home, how to take care of a husband, how to take care of children. And of course, I can even imagine that one old woman saying this when giving a very good eye to Washo. Girls, meat eating is a man's affair. It is not a women's affair. It is your man to decide what is going to be eaten, when it is going to be eaten, and for you to sit there and wait for you to be given what should be given, and you should never, ever be seen eating meat in public. And after this, the young women now went back to their homes ready for marriage. And soon, wedding bells were heard and celebrations as Nyambura got married, and Jerry got married, and Wangoi got married, and Wangari got married, and they were soon having children. But Washo still remains at her father's house. And well, it is not that she didn't have any suitors, but the young men would come, and they would watch, and they would shake their heads, and they would go. So how would they get the energy to explain to their mothers that they were bringing a woman who eats meat in public like a man? And things would have gone like this for a long time, were it not for a wise aunt who lived 3 ridges away. And during the harvesting season, she came and took Washo to help. And of course, after a bountiful harvest, the young men and the young women and the women and the men and the children, they would all come out to the village square, and they would sing and they would dance and they would celebrate. And during these dances, Washo found herself dancing more and more and more with this one particular young man. And just like the aunt had wished, by the end of the festive season, wedding bells were ringing, and Washo and this young man got married. And Washo soon settled into the routine of life. And I think being away from her home and all the work around home and having a child, well, I think she forgot about this whole business of eating meat. And they were really, in every sense of the word, a happy family. Until one day, of course, because otherwise there won't be a story. Until one day, when Washo was pregnant with her third child, she was sitting outside her house and the smell of nyama choma, roast meat, just wafting in the air. And all those wonderful memories of being at her home with her mother and father slaughtering and roasting and eating meat, came to her, and she couldn't stand it any longer, and she went into the shed and she picked a goat and she slaughtered, and she made the best nyama choma she had seen in a long, long time. And she sat down and ate and ate and ate and gave each of her 2 daughters. And she set aside some meat for her husband. Now you can imagine the shock when the husband came home and found that not only had Washo slaughtered a goat, she had roasted and eaten it with the girls and even set aside some meat for him. Washo, nenya moraria. Oh, yes. Oh, I ate meat and I gave my daughters. And don't worry, I have some meat for you. Washo, are you out of your mind? Don't you know that it is our tradition that women cannot slaughter, they cannot roast meat, they cannot eat meat unless the man of the house has actually given them this to eat? And Washo stood there and said, Nikki, why? Tell me why. Am I not the one who takes care of those animals, who knows what they eat, what they drink, where they sleep? So if I want to eat meat, why should I not go and slaughter and eat meat with my family? And the husband didn't have an answer. He said, it is tradition, but yeah, it is tradition, but why? And from that day, anytime Washo felt like eating meat, she would slaughter and she would roast and she would eat. And of course, the husband said, oh, this is weird, but maybe, just maybe, it is those cravings that pregnant women have. And who knows, maybe this time she will actually give birth to a baby boy. And when she gives birth, this craving will go away. Well, the husband was right in one aspect, that Washo indeed did give birth to a baby boy, but she didn't stop eating meat. And anytime the husband would ask, she would ask, tell me, why should I not eat meat? And of course, the husband would go out and discuss with his friends about this strange thing of this woman in the house, the wife, who had all of a sudden begun eating meat. And he would get a lot of advice. Someone would say, you are a very soft man. You are very soft. That is why she can actually do this more than one time. You know what? My woman knows who wears trousers in my house. Mine knows too. In fact, I make sure I beat her 2 times in a month just to remind her who is the head. And of course, they would discuss this as they took the traditional beer and they would drink and they would drink. And the husband would come home, and what had been a home full of joy and happiness and laughter became a home where screaming and shouting and arguments were had night after night. And finally, the elders decided that they were going to have a meeting to see what they could do about all these things. And on the day when they were deliberating about this, the different elders, they came and they sat down, and the young men slaughtered a big fat dege he-goat, you know, and some nice moratina, some traditional beer, to irrigate the throats of the elders as they deliberated. And as the elders sat there and they discussed, and some said, well, the woman does have a point. It is our culture that women should not eat meat in public, but the Maasai women actually eat meat in public with their men, and they're not regarded as disrespectful, isn't it? So why do we think that ours would be disrespectful if they were eating meat? And of course, others said, the Maasai women are the Maasai women. And our Kikuyu women are our Kikuyu women. We should not just let them do things because the Maasai women are doing it. Oh no, but wondering, culture is dynamic. So is it we humans who make culture, or does culture make us? And this whole deliberation went on and on and on. And outside, the young men had slaughtered the goats, put it on fire, and it was roasting, the aroma just wafting out into the air. And because the men realized that this conversation was going on and on, they went outside, ready to have their meat and some beer before they could go back to the deliberations. And the young men, seeing the older men coming out, they laid out the nyama choma and cut it into big, juicy pieces, ready to serve to the older men. And that is when it happened. Up from the sky came a big, huge eagle, and it came directly to where the young men were. And the young man was scared. Ooh, this big eagle, what is it planning to do? And they took off, and the eagle came and took a big chunk of the juicy meat and flew with it into the air. Now, of course, the young men just stand there and see the fruits of their sweat just disappearing like that. And they say, hey, someone just run after this, run. Let's make sure the eagle drops the meat. Hey, Mariah, you're the first one, run after it. And Mariah began running and running, knowing that the eagle was, of course, going to get tired and drop the meat. And they ran the eagle up in the sky, Mariah down through the gardens, the shambas, the farms. And Mariah saw the eagle drop the meat somewhere in the center of the farm. And he ran and ran. And when he got there, he saw a sight that he had not expected. For there, seated, was a woman who had stopped working on her farm, took up her panga, removed the soil from it, and was cutting huge chunks of the roast nyama choma meat and eating it. Oh, with the oil, the soup going down from her cheeks all the way to her dress. And your answer is as good as mine, because who do you think this woman was? It was none other than Washo, who had gone to work on her farm. And of course, Mariah was shocked. And Mariah ran back and called the men to come and see what was happening. Come and see. And the men hobbled as fast as they could on their walking sticks to come and withhold this woman who was eating meat that was literally dropped from the heavens. And that is when one of the men said, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, this is a sign from heaven. And the joy and the sweetness of meat is to be enjoyed by everyone, by men, by women, by children, whenever they want, wherever they want it. And so, as Kikuyu women, as a community, as Kenyans, we enjoy eating meat, eating roast meat. And of course, when you come here, please, you should not leave this country without enjoying some nice nyama choma as you remember this particular story. Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama, nyama, nyama.
Nyama.
Back to you, Momo.
Thank you so much for the story, for the interview, and for your energy and everything you gave to us until now.
Welcome back, everyone. So I'm happy I'm looking forward now to listening to your questions and insights, maybe. And I would also like to give space to the question already written by David in the chat, who asked about the story Feather Mirror Leaf. So maybe I'll just read the question. Momo, what do you think? Should we start with that one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So David wrote, thanks Wangari. I tell other variants of your beautiful Feather Mirror Leaf folktale from Estonia and from Palestine. I was given them by friends from those places. Your ending is quite different. Where does your variant come from? Is it your own reinvention of a Kenyan tale? How do you feel about people retelling tales they've learned from you outside Kenya, if they credit you as the source? Does it depend on the nature of the story? For instance, sacred tale or folk tale?
Okay, so the story actually, I think I should ask, because I first learned the story from a friend who is also a storyteller. And I think I should probably ask them about the ending, because that's the ending that I had from them. So it would be interesting to find out, like if the ending was there. But I think it is a Kenyan story, but I'm not sure about the ending. I will find out about that, and I will get back to you, David. I have absolutely no issue with people telling stories from Kenya, because I think being a Kenyan who, especially when you're learning about literature and myth and legends, you're learning a lot of myth and legends, especially like Greek myth and legends, and it is always interesting for me when I hear someone telling a story from Kenya, from Africa. And for me, it is always about just giving credit to where you find the story. And more especially, not just about giving credit, is about just trying to find out where in this huge African continent is your story coming from. I think sometimes when we don't even try to put effort to find out where the story is from, it's being lazy storytellers. That you just pick a story and you don't want to put any effort into finding out more about the story. You're just sharing it as it was. So yes, if you get a story from that I have told, whether it's in a live session, in a video, and you want to tell it, I'm always very okay with you telling it. Give credit, and also maybe also ask me, is that the original version, or is it like you also added your bits? So just in case you also want to go and add your bits here and there, I have no issue with that. And I think we're just speaking this a bit earlier with Momo, is that there are some people who, and some kinds of stories. So for instance, if there are stories that have a sacred meaning, or a meaning, personal stories especially, that have a specific meaning to somebody or some people or a place, then I think it's always important before you tell the story to just ask, if I hear a story from Ursula, for instance, and it's a story that, has been running in their family for years, it would be very wrong for me to just pick it and present it as if it is mine, because she might not know that, because she'll probably not be in any of my Kenyan audiences, listening to the story. But I think it's important for me to just say, this is a really nice story that I love, but I learned it from Ursula. It's not my personal story, not from my family, it's from so-and-so's family, but I loved it and I felt that I should share it with you.
Thank you. David, how do you feel about the answer?
Well, thank you very much, Wangari, for giving us your perspective on that. I think it's a really interesting question, because I think when I ask this question to different storytellers in different parts of the world, I hear as many different answers to that question as there are storytellers. And I think it does depend hugely on individuals, and also on sometimes, like I said at the end of the question, about the nature of the tale, whether that tale is perceived as being somehow a very particular story, a very special story, maybe even sacred to a particular culture, and the respect with which it's told or retold. But I was fascinated to hear that story, because it's one of my favorite stories to tell. And I was so surprised. I think I need to hear again the ending, because there was something about being transformed into a cooking utensil, a pot. Is that right? Which is quite different from the Palestinian and Estonian versions that I've been told.
Would you like to share the other versions, you know, from the story?
Well, I think I'd be taking up rather a lot of time by telling a whole of one of those stories.
Oh, is the ending? Are the endings longer endings then?
Oh well, essentially, there's in both versions from Estonia and Palestine, in those cases, the third item is an apple, a healing apple, and the girl, princess daughter, is fed the apple by the one who's brought the apple, and she comes back to life. She revives. She's well, and then she has to decide which one to marry. And of course, there is an answer here, because, and I always ask listeners to say who she should marry, but there is an answer here, because the one in the versions I tell, the ones who've brought the item that's brought her to travel there, and which could be a horse or a cart, or in this case a feather or a carpet, and the one who's brought the mirror, those items still exist, so she can give those items back to those friends, and they can use them again, and perhaps with the help of those items they will find the woman that they can marry. The one who brought the apple has now been eaten and consumed, so has no opportunity to use that gift again, and for that reason she marries the one who gave the apple.
Okay.
So that's the ending that I know of in both Palestine and Estonia. But I need to hear Wangari's ending again. Something about being transformed into a pot.
And 3 stones. Yes.
Yes, and I think also that's also a very, I think would be a very either Kenyan or African kind of ending, because I mean, in most places, especially the rural areas, the cooking happens in the kitchen, but on 3 stones and on a pot. So in a way, even though for instance, in this case, that you're supposed to get married, have a family, and that way your name will always be remembered because your name is going through the different generations. In this case, that you will always, in every house, these women and these young men will always be remembered anytime a meal is being prepared in that house.
That's beautiful. It's very beautiful.
Thank you. Maybe, as now we are approaching the time that we communicated as the ending, we can say something like 10 more minutes, if it feels good to you, in order to give some space to further questions.
Oh, I have a question for Wangari, and because and I was making notes and whatnot, and the questions seem to change every time as you went on speaking, Wangari. The questions changed. It's hard to boil it down, so I apologize. Try and get it back together again. But I noticed that you referred to 3 areas of story. The older stories, which were the oral traditions, before, let's say, before print. Then must have been a time when they switched over to the print form, because you mentioned your mother reading stories to you. And then you talked about becoming a storyteller, but that was a kind of an unusual profession. So who were the storytellers before that? And how did and you already mentioned that others are becoming quote unquote professional storytellers. So it's that jump between the oral to the printed, that I'm curious about, and I'd like to hear more about.
Because I think before the print came, is that the art of storytelling in the oral format was mostly by the grandparents. The grandparents who would actually share the stories with their grandchildren, mostly at the end of a day's work. And it could be for many different reasons. It could be just stories just for fun, could be stories to teach specific things, but could also stories teaching things as specific as how do you know your family tree? And I remember a few years ago, I met someone who actually, they were reciting their family tree in a story. And I found that very fascinating. So traditionally, it was mostly the older generation telling the stories to the younger people. And of course, there were some people who in the community who are known to be very good storytellers, but that was not the only work they did. It was just one of the many things they did. The same way we had someone whose practice was medicine, the same way you had someone whose practice was being, a blacksmith, but then they could also tell stories. And now with the coming of the colonial period, and now in the current generation whereby the grandparents, urbanization, so the families are living in very many different places, the grandparents are working, it becomes a bit harder in terms, especially in the urban areas, the family structure whereby the grandparents are still available to share these stories. And some of the grandparents that we have right now didn't grow up listening to stories. So they didn't hear the stories orally. And like I said, personally, I didn't grow up listening to oral stories. And my mother was not reading stories to me. I was reading stories to her. She would buy books, and then she taught me my mother tongue through stories. And so she would be sitting and I would be telling stories to her, which is, like it's the reverse of how it was traditionally. And now what has happened, I think for me and other people in the last, I've been in the field for about 10, 15 years now, is that we have people who are saying, my profession is a storyteller. I tell stories. So their life, they make a living through storytelling. And previously, this was not the case. Traditionally, it wasn't that, because I'm a storyteller, that's how I make my living, is that you are doing other things. And storytelling was one of the ways that you were to do. And maybe I would also just ask Mshai, because I can see Mshai is here, to also just talk about it, because one thing about Mshai that I also find very interesting is that apart from being a performer, she's also a scholar who is specializing around, stories and performance. So Mshai, what would your take on that?
But I mean, I would agree largely with you. I think they're different generations, but also if you think of, I like to think of orality as just being part of this bigger space where some communities in Africa were literate, some of them inscribed stories in different things and in different manners, and then they're the ones who primarily did all their education using the spoken word. And I think as that changed, first of all, there's a lot of research that's been done. So people began encoding and documenting certain stories, but there's always been the oral culture. I don't think it's ever died. And I think I agree with Wangari, even though I think some cultures also did have professional storytellers. So you hear of the griots and the griots, and often associated, for some it was for sacred reasons, for some it was for political reasons. But that generation of traditional professions has more or less died out. And what we are getting, as Wangari said, is people who see it, just as you have actors and you have directors and you have people who say, I work in film. Storytelling is becoming really big again. And people are now stepping out. Like, I'm theater trained, I'm an actor, I'm a director. But more or less in the last few years, I'm identifying as a storyteller, as a professional storyteller. And I think there's a whole range of people, a lot of teachers also. It's become part of, if you're teaching in junior primary, Wangari, what do you think? A lot of them have to be storytellers because people are going back to how do you teach language, and going back to saying some of the things we abandoned in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we need to bring them back now. Back to you, Wangari.
Yeah, and also just to add on that, I think most of my workshops are usually with teachers on how to use stories in class. So, yeah.
Wangari, I don't know, there's no hand to go up, so I'll just be rude and interrupt and answer a question that David asked. But one of the questions, before I do that, one of the questions I asked myself and wrote down was, where do stories live? Oral traditions, books, among the storytellers, and that question has an infinitely long answer because Mishai, you said, you told that the stories exist, but they are often existing in different and odd forms, either spoken word or books or whatever, and they're then used for many different purposes. But I think of stories like water. It's carried in many kinds of vessels. And one of the vessels that they're carried in is books. And over the years, a long answer, short answer is I've accumulated about 6,000 volumes of folktales from around the world, with the idea that they become a resource for storytellers, story listeners, anybody who walks through my door in my flat in Toronto. And 6,000 sounds like a lot, and I consider a tip of the iceberg of what we need to answer the questions that I think that need to be asked and need to be answered. And most of them are in English. I wish there was a dozen languages that those books were. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to say is that we as storytellers need this kind of well in which to dip our buckets in with the question being the bucket being the question. We pull up the stories, what the stories are to be used for, maybe to read to our mothers, read to our children, re-enter the stories back into the oral tradition. You can add to the list. But essentially, I want the Four Winds Library to be the beginning of that resource for storytellers. Does that answer your question, David?
Well, there's a question that I asked in the chat, Norman, which was because you named a particular book, Richard Dawson, The British Folklorist of History. I just wondered why you were thinking that book was particularly relevant. I think you're muted, Norman.
I put it in as a written answer to the question asked during our chat with I've forgotten his Bernard. So yeah. Sorry, I gave a longer answer than I should have. I apologize. But the thing is, Wangari, I'm fascinated by your story because it's a story of transitions and changes. But what remains behind is the need for the story to survive for many different communities and many different reasons. That's all I have to say.
Are there further questions?
Or comments as well?
So maybe I step in. I'm very grateful for this interview, and also Mshai, thank you. And but I can't think anymore. I'm getting headache and yes, thank you.
Thank you, Bernhard, for sharing. I actually have a question because especially in the beginning of the interview, you told us about the program about colonial history. And I would be interested, and I, as a white person living in Germany, how can I be an ally for decolonialism, like for decolonization? How can I support you with that issue?
Well, I think the reason why we do that, I do that show, is more to be able to give a platform for this very hard and controversial topic. Because at the end of the day, like I said, most people prefer not to discuss difficult things. And even here locally, it's seen that it's something that happened so many years ago. So why do we need to discuss it? But I think the effects are felt very strongly even today. So, and my reasoning has always been that, for instance, right now, it is very easy for a child who is living in Germany, in France, in the US, in Syria, in Morocco, to meet with a child from Kenya. It wasn't the same 50 or 100 years ago. And I would want that when these children, especially, because the piece initially was actually specifically for children 8 and above, is that the story of Africa, when it is told in Europe, in the West, is told from a very singular perspective. We're talking about issues around poverty, about disease, about war, about displacement. What I would want for me, and why I am part of that project, is that let's look behind the numbers. Let's look behind the facts and see the stories behind it. So instead of just saying, oh, South Africa got independence in 1994, Mandela was in prison for 20 whatever years. What are the stories behind it? When you say that the Herero massacre, 40,000 people died, of course it's horrifying, 40,000 people. But what is the story behind it? Who is this 40,000? Because those are 40,000 different stories behind it. So the idea is to discuss these stories, because I would want that when you see someone, don't just take it as, aha, oh, they're from Syria. They probably came here because, they came as refugees. Maybe the story is very different. The same way, I think, when I am in Europe and people ask me, okay, so have you experienced any racism? And I say, personally, I have not experienced any. And in some places, I see that it's like they're kind of disappointed that, oh, really? You have not experienced this? And I say maybe it's also because the spaces that I go to, so the story there is that, of course, for most Africans, it's like, okay, of course, if you go there, you get racism, you get this. But me as a person, I have not. And maybe it's because the spaces I go to are more open to this discussion. I'm in spaces where it is in festivals. So it is in people who are more aware of this and are more likely to discuss these kinds of things. It is artists who are more liberal, who are probably interacting with the world a bit more. So let's not just see something from a single lens. And I remember when we began doing this piece, actually, and someone online said, hey, because we were saying this is an African perspective, and said, you should not say it's an African perspective, because what do you mean by that? And I remember a friend of mine, a scholar, said, you know what, there is nothing wrong with having this perspective. In fact, we need as many perspectives as possible, because especially when these stories have been told, they have been told from the lenses of Europe and the West. But for me, it's basically to have that discussion of saying, you know what, first of all, to recognize our privileges. I say, of course, I'm an African, I am a Kenyan, but I also recognize the privilege that even though I am a Kenyan, I am a woman, I've had the opportunity to travel around, I've had the opportunity to go to school. So of course, I'm a bit more exposed. And so how can I use that privilege, wherever it is that I am, to to make sure that the stories told around me are not just showing one perspective, for instance, So when I find someone from Libya or from Syria, I don't just look at, oh, okay, wow, these Africans are risking their whole lives traveling on sea. They don't even know if they get here. It's like, okay, but how did it get here that they are actually risking their lives to cross the sea to come to this particular place? Let's learn to look behind the facts, behind the numbers that we are always giving around. Okay, so this happened in this year, this number of people did this. Let's look at the story behind the numbers. And I think for me, that is basically it. Recognize your privilege in the first place, wherever it is that you are. And two, look at the stories behind the numbers. Don't just assume that, when I see, when I see, a white person in Kenya, I'm like, oh, money. It's very, very different stories, or tourists, or those kind of things. Look at the stories behind the numbers, recognize your privilege, and see how you can use your privilege to make the environment around you better, safer for everyone else.
Thank you so much. Do you have other questions that you would like to ask?
I'd just like to thank Wangari for your generosity, giving all this time and ideas and yourself and your stories. And as ever, I'm always grateful for what you share. Thank you, Wangari, and thank you, Momo and Victoria, for hosting this event so beautifully.
Thank you for your appreciation. And I would like to pass the word to Momo and to Wangari for concluding this evening.
Yeah, I'm fully with David, who's much more capable of English, to say how grateful I am for this interview and the opportunity in my life to host this interview. And I'm feeling like I ate a lot of, I'm like very satisfied with so much beautiful words and talks, and your energy. I said it that you gave so much energy into this interview, and it makes me feel like I should go on with the project, because it really is really filling my heart that this was working so beautifully, and we came together, and I feel you as the audience and everybody. I just feel this heartful connection. So thank you for being here, Wangari, and thank you for you being here in the interview. And I will always thank those who are watching us later on from October. Maybe Victoria, you can also, because I have to say that, put the donation site in the chat. I will also put it under the video, so this project can be long-term after the first interviews, because I think it is so valuable to hear a lot of different perspectives, and that we just connect and talk and have this lively and nice discussions and talks with one another. Thank you for being here and making the start, Wangari. Thank you. And thank you, Victoria, for holding the room. I don't know how to say that in English, but for giving us a safe environment. For me also, because it's very important to have you in the background for me to feel good and safe in the interview. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you,
Welcome.
everyone. Thank you, Momo, Victoria, for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward also to the other interviews with the other storytellers, because I think that's also how you learn. Thank you guys for being here from the beginning to the end. I know if you're on my side of the street, it's almost midnight. So, so it's really a privilege. And maybe just to mention that, you know, for the ones who are in Germany, if you are anywhere near Hamburg, if everything works out, I will be in Hamburg at the end of October for a couple of days for the Fluktoplasma Festival. And yes, Momo, I promise if you come, you won't hear any depressing stories. I will try to make the stories I tell as light and as happy as, you know, away from the story that you had last time. So if you're around between the 29th, I think 29th of October, you're welcome to come and be part of the show.
Oh,
And thank you guys for everything.
thank you.
Thank you. And if you feel like it, you can also share a word in the chat. Yeah, what you take. But also, like, yeah, I say this to all of you, our audience, but also if you're just tired and satisfied with this good food for thought, like Momo said, you're also welcome to just leave and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you for having been here.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you to everyone.
Thanks
I'm
a lot.
stuck too. Oh. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.